The assumption most people make about the avoidant's eventual partner is shaped by the experience of being the person the avoidant could not fully choose. The experience of being deeply connected to someone, of reaching them in the specific and irreplaceable way examined throughout these pieces, and then watching them maintain the distance that prevented the connection from becoming the relationship it was reaching toward. The assumption that forms from this experience is this: the avoidant ends up with someone easier, someone who asks less, someone whose emotional requirements are lower and whose tolerance for the avoidance patterns is higher, someone who fits inside the avoidance limitations rather than pressing against them. The assumption is understandable. The evidence that appears to support it is real. The avoidant does often move toward people who generate less intimacy pressure, who require less of the vulnerability that the avoidance fear manages against, who produce fewer of the interior disruptions that genuine depth of connection produces. The movement toward ease is real, but the movement toward ease is not the same as the ending up with ease, and what the avoidant actually ends up with. So when the ending up is genuine, rather than the latest iteration of the managed distance dynamic, is something more specific and more significant than someone who simply makes the pattern easier to sustain. The avoidant who has not done any genuine internal work ends up not with a particular type of person, but with a particular configuration of dynamic. They end up with the relationship that their pattern is most comfortable sustaining, which is the relationship that never fully forms, the connection that stays in the almost but not quite territory indefinitely, the arrangement that provides enough warmth to sustain the avoidant's ambient need for connection and enough distance to prevent the intimacy pressure from reaching the threshold at which the management protocol activates at full capacity. This arrangement can look from the outside like a relationship. It has the relational markers, shared time, some degree of mutual caring, the social legibility of two people who are in each other's lives in a consistent way, but it does not have the substance that genuine relationship requires, the genuine knowing of each other, the mutual accountability for the impact of each person's behavior on the other, the shared, explicitly acknowledged investment in each other's flourishing, the sustained, unglamorous daily practice of choosing each other not in the grand moments but in the ordinary ones. The avoidant ends up with the person who does not require these things, not because the person does not deserve them. They may deserve them fully and be receiving them inadequately, may be carrying, in their own way, the specific cost of loving someone who cannot sustain the full expression of what they feel, but because the avoidance pattern selects for the person whose needs can be most efficiently managed at a distance, whose caring can be received without being fully reciprocated, whose continued presence does not require the vulnerability that full reciprocity would demand. This is not a happy ending for either person. The avoidant who has done the genuine work, who has moved through the reckoning, done the therapeutic engagement, developed the capacity to inhabit closeness without the management protocol consuming the experience, ends up with someone different, not dramatically different in the surface qualities that attraction operates on, but fundamentally different in the interior quality that the healed avoidant can now receive. They end up with someone real. Not real in the sense of existing as opposed to being imagined. All the people the avoidant has been with have been real in that sense. Real in the specific, demanding, vulnerability requiring sense of someone whose full, actual, unmanaged personhood is present in the relationship. Someone who has needs and expresses them and expects them to be met. Someone who has feelings about the avoidant's behavior and communicates those feelings directly. Someone who is not accommodating themselves to the avoidance limitations, but is instead with the specific and non-negotiable quality of someone who has a genuine relationship with their own worth, present as they actually are and expecting to be met as they actually are. The healed avoidant can be with this person, not easily, not without the ongoing, imperfect, sometimes failing work of interrupting the old pattern when it surfaces, but genuinely, in the specific sense of being actually present in the relationship rather than managing it from a safe distance, And the person they end up with is often recognizably the type of person examined throughout these pieces. The grounded, self-possessed, genuinely whole person whose presence does not generate the intimacy pressure that the unhealed avoidance system cannot manage, whose caring comes from abundance, whose love does not arrive as demand, who is fully themselves in the relationship without requiring the avoidant to be less than fully themselves in return. But here is the thing that the assumption most consistently misses, and that this piece is most specifically trying to address. The avoidant who ends up with the right person, with the grounded, whole, self-possessed person who produces the specific quality of connection that the avoidant has always, in the interior, been reaching for, does not end up with them by accident. Does not stumble into the right relationship simply by the fortunate coincidence of encountering the right person at the right moment. They end up with them because something changed, because the reckoning arrived through the accumulated losses, through the specific and irreversible weight of having lost people who mattered, through the therapeutic work or the internal confrontation or the specific crisis of self-knowledge that the pattern's costs eventually produce, and the reckoning produced the change. The genuine, internally motivated, sustained against the fear's resistance change that made the right relationship possible. And the change almost always has a specific origin, a specific loss, a specific person whose particular qualities, whose depth, whose wholeness, whose non-demanding presence, whose walking away from the insufficient version of the connection produce the specific interior disruption that was the beginning of the avoidance journey toward the capacity to be in a genuine relationship. That person is often you, not you specifically, not in every case, not as a universal law, but the person who reaches the avoidant in the specific way that you reach them. The person who demonstrated through the quality of their presence and the quality of their eventual walking away that genuine connection was possible, and that the avoidance pattern was preventing it. The person whose loss was specific enough and weighty enough to begin the reckoning that the change required. The avoidant who ends up with someone real, who arrives through genuine work at the capacity to sustain a genuine relationship, carries the impact of the people who showed them what genuine connection felt like, who reached the interior, who stayed long enough to demonstrate the real quality of what was possible, who left in a way that made the full cost of the pattern undeniable. The person they end up with benefits from all of this, benefits from the reckoning that was partly generated by the loss of someone like you, benefits from the internal work that the loss motivated, benefits from the changed relationship with the fear that the work produced, is, in a specific and rarely acknowledged sense, the recipient of something you contributed to building, the capacity for genuine relationship that you, through your presence and your leaving, helped make possible. This is not a comfortable piece of information to hold. The person who did the work of reaching the avoidant, who paid the cost of the pattern, who eventually walked away with their dignity and their self-respect, this person is not necessarily the person who receives the version of the avoidant that the work produced. Sometimes they are. Sometimes the reckoning produces the reaching back. The genuine change is demonstrated through sustained changed behavior. The original connection is restored with the different foundation that the work created. This happens. It is not the majority outcome, but it is a real one. More often, the person who receives the changed avoidant is someone new, someone who encounters the avoidant after the reckoning, after the work, after the fear has been addressed sufficiently that the genuine relationship is possible. Someone who benefits from the change without having borne the cost of producing it. This is not unfair in the sense of anyone having done something wrong. The avoidant did not plan this outcome. The new person did not take something that belonged to you. The reckoning and the work were the avoidant's own, however they were motivated. But it is worth naming honestly, because one of the ways people who have loved avoidance torment themselves is through the fantasy of the avoidant changing for someone else, of witnessing from a distance the avoidant becoming capable of the relationship they could never quite become capable of while you were the one offering it. If this happens, it is not evidence that you were insufficient. It is not the verdict that the avoidance pattern suggested it was, the verdict that you were not worth the changing for. It is simply the timing of a process that your presence, your loving, your eventual walking away helped to initiate. The fruit of a tree you planted and did not remain to harvest. That is a loss. A specific, real, not to be minimized loss. And it is also the truth of how change sometimes works, through the accumulated impact of the people who mattered enough to make the cost of not changing finally, undeniably, larger than the cost of changing. You mattered enough. You were the cost generator. You were, in the interior accounting that the avoidant carries but rarely speaks, one of the reasons the change finally became possible. Not the recipient of it, but the reason for it. And that reason, however it costs to hold, however insufficient it feels as the return on everything you gave, was real, was significant, was in the deepest architecture of what produced the avoidant's eventual capacity for the genuine relationship they went on to have. You, your presence, your depth, your walking away, all of it, working in the direction of something genuine for someone who finally, too late for you, learned how to receive it.